What would you do if a man leaned across your father's coffin and told you, plain as weather, that no woman had ever held land in your family, and you already knew, in the pit of your chest, that he was lying? This is the story of Emma Mercer, 18 years old, who inherited nothing but a folded page and a mocked name, and who walked out of a country churchyard with the whole of Mercer End behind her, and every man in it certain she would come to nothing. But what she found, one damp lease at a time, would set that certainty on its head. Settle in. Keep the fire close. Let us know where you're watching from tonight. She arrived home in the last hour of a gray October afternoon, her boots caked to the ankle with the yellow mud of the coach road, her morning dress stiff with a week of rain and hedgerow travel. The village of Mercer End sat exactly as she had left it. Low stone cottages leaning into the wind, slate roofs blackened with lichen, one crooked lane running past the churchyard to the estate gate. Smoke from the kitchen smelled of coal and wet turf. A rook called from the yew and got no answer. Emma carried a single carpet bag and folded inside her glove a letter from the parish clerk telling her that her father had been laid in the ground 3 days before the coach could bring her from the school where she had been sent, 2 counties away, to be made into someone with better prospects. There had been no time to say goodbye. There had been no one, in the end, to insist she be sent for sooner. She passed the churchyard without stopping. She could not, yet. Her father's grave was too new, and the earth over it too raw, and the thing in her throat too near the surface. She kept her eyes on the lane and on the pale, wet light burning behind the trees, and she walked on toward the low stone house at the far end of the village where the Mercer name had lived for 4 generations. At the gate, her cousin Bram Mercer was already waiting for her, thick in his frock coat, boots planted wide, a ledger tucked under one arm as though he had been born holding it. He did not embrace her. He did not step aside. "You are late," he said. "The coach was late," Emma murmured. "Well." He looked her up and down, and his mouth found the small hard shape it always found when it was about to say something cruel and call it fact. "You are here now. There is little enough to do." Behind him, through the open door, she could see the front room already halved by his presence. His hat on her father's chair, his gloves on her father's table, his handwriting in a fresh column down the household book. 6 days in the grave, 6 days. She said nothing. She followed him inside. That evening, by the light of a single tallow candle in what had been her father's study, Bram set before her a folded page of stiff paper with a red seal broken and reset. He tapped it twice with the back of his knuckle. "Your inheritance," he said. Emma unfolded it slowly. It was a deed of some kind, though the ink had gone brown at the creases and the language was old enough to catch on the eye. A name of a field she half remembered. A boundary described by a hedge and a ditch and a well long since fallen in. The paper smelled faintly of mildew and pipe smoke. "That plot has not been worked since your grandmother's time," Bram said. "Wet ground, rushes, not a shilling in it. You will not thank me for it, but there it is. The house and the tenancies passed to me by the settlement, as is proper. No woman has ever held land in this family, Emma. Do not go putting notions in your head." She looked up at him. The candle flame narrowed and steadied. "I take the paper," she said. He laughed once, sharp, and pushed back from the table. "Take it and welcome. Frame it if you like. It will keep the draft off a wall." He left her the candle and the deed and the smell of his tobacco in the curtains, and he went out to arrange somewhere in the front room the last of her father's affairs to suit himself. Emma sat a long time with the paper open across her knees. Rushes, wet ground, a ditch, and a well. She traced the boundary lines with the tip of one reddened finger and felt, without knowing why, that the page was heavier than it ought to be, as if what was written on it were only the top layer of something else, something older, folded beneath. Somewhere in the back of her memory, in a voice she had not heard in 8 years, her mother said, quite clearly, "Keep the papers, Emma. Keep everyone." Now, would you have taken the wet plot and thanked him for it, or thrown it in the fire? What did Bram Mercer see in that deed that made him so willing to give it away? And what, tucked beneath its old brown ink, was he too proud to read? If this quiet beginning has caught you, take a moment to like the video, leave a word in the comments, and subscribe so you stay with Emma to the end. because what she carried up the stairs that night was not a scrap of wet ground. It was a thread, and she had already begun, without knowing it, to pull. By morning, the village knew. Emma had said nothing to anyone but the housekeeper, who said nothing to anyone but her sister, and by the time Emma crossed the churchyard wall on her way to the market office, the whole of Mercer End had the shape of the story in its mouth. The girl had come back too late for the burial. The girl had been given the sour field by the ditch. The girl had taken it. That last was said with a particular pleasure, as if the taking were the joke and the ditch only the setting for it. She felt it before she heard it. 2 women at the pump stopped speaking when she passed and began again when she was 6 paces on. A boy driving geese down the lane looked at her boots, and then at her face, and then away. Outside the smithy 3 men in work smocks leaned on the fence rail, and one of them said, not quite low enough, "That's the one with the rushes." Another laughed into his sleeve. Emma kept walking. Her morning dress was still marked at the hem from the coach road. Her hands were bare and cold. She had folded the deed into the inside pocket of her cloak, and she could feel the edge of it against her ribs with every step. At the market office the clerk was not in. She waited on the bench by the door. A carter came out of the back room, saw her, tipped his cap without warmth, and said to the ledger boy behind him, loud enough to carry, "Bram's little heiress." The ledger boy grinned. Emma folded her hands in her lap and looked at the flagstones. She did not answer. She had learned in the school 2 counties away that a girl who answered was a girl the room remembered. A girl who sat still was a girl the room grew tired of. She was still sitting when the door opened and an old woman came in out of the weather. The woman was thin, upright, dressed in a black shawl gone gray at the folds, and she used a stick with a worn brass ferrule. Emma knew her face without being able to place it. One of the widows who had sat in the back pew when Emma was small, one of the women who had known her mother. The old woman looked at Emma a long moment. Her eyes were pale and quiet. "You are Anne's girl," she said. "Yes," Emma murmured. The old woman nodded once, as if a thing had been settled. She came a step closer and lowered her voice, though the ledger boy was pretending not to listen. "The ditch remembers what the house forgets," she said. Emma opened her mouth and closed it again. The old woman did not explain. She only touched Emma's sleeve with 2 dry fingers, as one might steady a candle in a draught, and then went past her to the counter to inquire about a corn measure, and did not look back. Emma sat with the words settling on her like ash. That afternoon, coming home along the lane, she met Bram at the estate gate. He had a riding crop under his arm and a broad, bright color in his cheeks from the cold. He saw her and stopped, and his mouth opened in the pleased way of a man who has been waiting to say the thing. "Cousin," he said, "I hear you've been at the market." "I have?" "Inquiring after your estate." He said the word as if it tasted of sugar. 2 farm hands at the gate paused in their work. "Tell me, Emma, have you engaged a steward yet, or will you drain the ditch yourself?" The farm hands laughed. Bram laughed with them generously, as a man laughs who has given the room its permission. "I have not decided," Emma said. "No," he said. "No, I imagine not." He tapped the crop against his boot. "A little advice, cousin. Do not make yourself a spectacle. It reflects on the name." He nodded at her and went past her into the yard, and the farm hands, still smiling, went back to their work. Emma stood at the gate a moment longer and let the cold air steady her face. Then she walked inside and up the stairs and shut the door of her small room and took the deed out of her cloak and laid it on the sill in the last of the light and read the boundary again, hedge, ditch, well, and heard, very faintly, the old woman's voice. "The ditch remembers what the house forgets." She did not yet know what it meant. She only knew she would go and see the ground. She went the next morning before it was properly light. The housekeeper gave her bread and a wedge of cheese wrapped in a cloth, and told her the way as if Emma had never been a child in that country, and Emma thanked her and did not correct her. The lane out past the churchyard bent east through hedgerows still black with wet. A thin mist lay in the low places. Her boots picked up the yellow mud again within 100 paces, and by the time she reached the stile at the top of the long slope, her hem was heavy and her breath went white in front of her. From the stile the ground fell away to a shallow bowl of pasture and rough, and beyond that to a strip of low field held between a crooked hedge on one side and a slow brown ditch on the other. That was the plot. She knew it without being told. It lay under a skin of standing water in the deeper hollows, and clumps of rushes stood black-green against the gray, and a single hawthorn, half fallen, marked the far corner where the well was said to be. The sky above it was the color of pewter. A crow lifted from the hedge and went sideways on the wind. She climbed down the stile and walked out along the headland. The ground gave under her boots with a soft sucking sound. Rushes brushed her skirts to the knee. She reached the hawthorn and stood a long while looking at the ring of stones half drowned in the grass where the old well had fallen in. Someone, a long time ago, had set those stones with care. The courses were still true where the moss had not lifted them. She walked the boundary, hedge on the north, thick, old, laid by a hand that had known the work. Ditch on the east, deeper than Bram's voice had made it sound, cut clean once, though the sides had slumped. To the south, a low bank of turf that did not match the field beyond it. She noted these things without yet naming them to herself. She was cold to the bone by the time she had gone round once. There was a shepherd's hut at the top corner, roofless, its door long gone, its walls sound to shoulder height. She went in out of the wind and sat on the stone bench inside and ate the bread and cheese slowly. The light thickened. A thin rain began and stopped. She did not go home. She stayed until the dusk came down blue over the ditch and the rushes went black, and then she wrapped her shawl twice and lay down on the bench with her carpet bag under her head and listened. The ground made small sounds after dark. Water moved in the ditch. Something small, a vole or a rat, worked in the hedge. The wind came down the slope and turned in the hut and went out again. Once, far off, a dog barked, and once, nearer, a owl called twice and was quiet. Emma lay with her eyes open and thought, "This is the wet ground he laughed at. This is the not a shilling." And under that thought, quieter, another. Someone laid this hedge. Someone cut this ditch. Someone set those stones around that well. None of it had done itself. None of it had been done for nothing. She slept a little toward morning and woke with frost on her shawl and the light just beginning to lift the edge of the sky, and she did not yet know what she was looking for, only that she had come to the right place to begin. She rose stiff and slow, folded the shawl, and went out into the field with the light coming gray behind her. The frost had silvered the rushes and made the ditch water look like tin. She walked the boundary again, more slowly this time, because a thing seen twice is not the same as a thing seen once. At the northeast corner, where the hedge turned down to meet the ditch, she stopped. There was a stone set into the turf. It was not a large stone. It stood no higher than her knee, and leaned a little into the hedge, as if the hedge had grown up around it and pressed it there. Moss covered its face. Emma knelt, and with the edge of her glove, wiped the moss aside. Beneath the moss, the stone had been dressed by a hand, the corners squared, the top rounded. Cut into the face, weathered but still legible, were 3 letters and a mark, an A, an M, and what might have been a date she could not read, and above them a small deep cross. She sat back on her heels. A.M. Her mother had been Anne Mercer, but the stone was older than her mother, older than the house perhaps, and the A.M. might have been anyone. Still, her hand had gone cold inside the glove. She traced the mark with her thumb. It was set for someone who had wanted it set, and set by someone who could dress stone, and placed in the corner of a field a man had called worth nothing. She stood and looked at the whole plot again. Now the hedge was not a hedge only, and the ditch was not a ditch only, and the stones around the fallen well were not stones only. They were the work of hands, and hands leave a record whether the papers agree or not. She did not act. She only marked the place in her mind. 3rd post from the corner, 2 paces in from the hedge, and covered the stone again with the loose moss she had pulled aside. Whatever it was, she did not want Bram to know of it before she did. She walked home in the low light. The lane was frozen at the crown and soft at the edges, and her boots rang on the ridges. When she came in by the kitchen door, the housekeeper looked up from the fire and looked her over once and said nothing, which was a kindness. Emma put the carpet bag on the settle and warmed her hands. "You slept out," the housekeeper said. "I did. Bram was in the study." Emma looked at her. "He looked at your father's papers." Emma said nothing. She took off her cloak and hung it, and the deed shifted against the lining as it moved. Bram was in the front room now. She could hear his boots crossing the boards above. She went up the back stairs to her own small room, and shut the door, and put the deed under her mattress, and lay a long moment on the bed with her forehead against the cold wood of the bed frame. Someone had set a stone with letters on it in the corner of the sour field. Someone had wanted it remembered. She would find out who. That was the beginning of the work. She began the next morning, and she began with her hands, because her hands could go where her name could not. She could not walk into the estate office and ask Bram for the household book. She could ask instead the housekeeper for a broom, and the housekeeper for a bucket, and the housekeeper for the key to the little room off the scullery where her father had kept his old boxes. The little room was cold, and had a slate floor and one high window. There were 3 chests along the wall and a shelf of leather books gone green at the spines. Emma tied her apron, rolled her sleeves to the elbow, and set to it. She dusted the shelf. She wiped the tops of the chests. She lifted each book down one at a time, held it to the light, and turned the pages slowly with a cloth over her fingers. Most were farm books, yields, wages, a long argument over a horse, but she read them all because she did not yet know what she was looking for. By afternoon her back hurt and her hands were black. She had found nothing that named the field. She sat on the floor with the last of the books and turned each page, and, near the end, came upon a folded scrap of paper set between 2 blanks. It was a receipt, in a hand she did not know, for hedging work paid to a man called Turner in the year 1834. The plot was named on the receipt. It was named as Anne's Piece. Emma held the receipt a long time. Then she folded it carefully and put it inside the front of her dress against her ribs where the deed had been. Over the following days she worked from morning to dusk in the little room. She scrubbed the slate floor. She oiled the hinges of the chests so they would open without shrieking through the house. She emptied one chest and refilled it in order and set the papers she wanted at the bottom, under the linens. Bram, passing once in the hall, looked in, saw her on her knees with a rag, and laughed shortly and went away. He thought she was making herself useful in the only way a girl could. That suited her. The housekeeper began, without speaking of it, to leave small things where Emma would find them. A tin box of dry candles, a pot of ink, a short knife for cutting string. And, on the 3rd morning, laid across the settle in the kitchen at first light, her father's old walking stick. Dark ash, the handle worn to the shape of a hand, an iron ferrule at the tip. Emma took it up and felt the balance of it, and knew the housekeeper had chosen well. From that day the stick went with her everywhere she went outside the house. When she leaned it in the corner of the little room while she worked, it stood watching. When she went out into the lanes, it thudded softly beside her on the frozen ground. It was not company that spoke, but it was company. She went back to the field twice that first week, always at odd hours, always by a different way. Each time she saw more. On the 2nd visit she found along the ditch, where the sides had slumped, the ends of old drain tiles buried in the mud. Someone had once drained this ground and the drains had been stopped up. On the 3rd visit she found in the wall of the fallen well a course of brick set in among the stone, and on one brick a maker's mark she copied onto the back of her housekeeper's marketing list with a pencil stub. She began to walk further. She walked to the next village by way of the hedgerows and asked, at the smithy there, whether anyone remembered a man called Turner who had laid hedges in the parish. An old smith wiped his hands and thought and said there had been a Turner at Ash Cottage, gone these 15 years, but his daughter kept the cottage still. Emma thanked him and walked the 2 miles to Ash Cottage with the ash stick tapping beside her, and came home after dark with a name and a direction written in her mind. Every night, in the little room, by one tallow candle, she made her notes. She copied the boundary from the deed onto a sheet of stiff paper and marked on it, in pencil, each thing she had found. The the stone with AM, the drain tiles, the brick with the mark, the receipt for Anne's piece. The paper grew crowded. Her hands, at night, ached and cracked at the knuckles, and she rubbed them with the housekeeper's tallow and slept. She did not yet know what shape the thing was, but her hands were beginning to know it, and the ash stick, standing in its corner, seemed to know it too. Turner's daughter was a small woman, with hands like her father's and a face weathered by open air. She met Emma at the low door of Ash Cottage on the second visit, remembered her mother, and after a long look, invited her inside. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and drying herbs. On a shelf above the hearth sat a row of tin boxes, and behind the boxes, wedged against the plaster, a bundle of papers tied with string blackened by years of soot. Turner's daughter took the bundle down without ceremony. She said her father had kept his own accounts because he had never trusted the estate office. She said Emma was welcome to look. She set a mug of weak tea by Emma's elbow and went out to the yard to feed her hens. Emma untied the string. The papers were receipts and hedging notes in a plain hand, and among them she found 4 folded sheets that were not receipts. She smoothed the first against the table. It was a copy, in Turner's careful writing, of a marriage settlement dated 42 years before. The names on it were her grandmother's and her grandfather's. The settlement listed, in the wife's portion, 3 parcels of ground, the low field by the ditch, a strip of pasture beyond the hawthorn, and a garden plot behind the cottages on the lane. Emma read it twice. Her breath went shallow. The second sheet was a copy of a lease, signed by her grandmother alone, granting the pasture strip to a tenant for a term of years now long expired. The third was a receipt for a fine paid to the manor court by her mother, Anne Mercer, in the year of Emma's birth, for the renewal of a customary right on the garden plot. The fourth was a letter, unsent, folded small, in her mother's hand, addressed to a solicitor in the market town, asking what steps a woman might take to protect her daughter's portion from a cousin's claim. Emma laid the 4 sheets flat and put her hand over them. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the hens muttered, and Turner's daughter spoke to them softly. Emma understood, sitting there, that the field had never been the whole of it. The field was one corner of what had been kept from the women of the family piece by piece across 3 generations, and Turner had made copies because a hedger who worked the boundaries of a parish knew which stones had been moved and which had not. Turner's daughter came back in and stood by the door. He said, "Keep them," she said, "for the girl." "Which girl?" Emma asked. "Anne's girl." Emma folded each sheet with care and tied the 4 again in a smaller bundle with the same blackened string. She thanked Turner's daughter. She could not for a moment stand. When she did, the ash stick in her hand felt heavier and truer than it had that morning. She walked home in the last blue of the afternoon. Frost was forming again on the ruts. She held the bundle under her cloak against her ribs over the place where the deed had been, and she thought of her mother's voice from 8 years earlier and understood now what her mother had been telling her to keep. She understood, too, that her mother had tried and had not lived long enough to finish. At the estate gate she paused. The house showed one lit window in the front room where Bram sat. Emma did not go in by the front. She went round to the kitchen door, greeted the housekeeper without speaking of the bundle, climbed the back stairs, and in her small room, by the single candle, laid the 4 sheets beside her map of the field. She wept once, briefly, into the crook of her elbow, and then she wiped her face and began to copy. She copied through the night. She copied the settlement, the lease, the fine, and the unsent letter, in her own hand, twice each, on fresh paper. She hid the originals in the linen chest in the little room beneath a folded sheet. She hid one set of copies under her mattress with the deed. The other set she meant to carry to the market town, to the solicitor her mother had named, as soon as the roads were fit. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window until the sky turned from black to the color of pewter, and she watched the frost on the yard stones brighten as the light came, and she understood that she had, at last, found the shape of the thing. The storm came 3 nights later. It began at dusk with a low, uneasy wind, and by midnight was driving sleet against the shutters and stripping slates from the roofs along the lane. Emma had gone to bed dressed because she meant to rise before light to walk to the market town, and she lay listening to the wind lift and drop and lift again against the corner of the house. Sometime past midnight there was a hammering on the kitchen door. Emma went down in her stockings with the candle shielded by her hand. The housekeeper was already at the door. On the step stood a woman Emma did not know, holding a child of perhaps 4 years wrapped in a shawl, and behind her a boy of 8 with his hair plastered to his forehead. The woman was a tenant's wife from the cottages on the lane. The wind had taken half her roof and the rain was coming down inside. "The little one is sick," the woman said. "Please." Emma opened the door wider. She put them by the kitchen fire. She fetched dry blankets from the press upstairs. She heated milk with a spoon of honey for the child, whose breath rattled shallow and quick, and she sent the housekeeper to wake the boy from the stable to run for the doctor 2 villages over. The housekeeper hesitated at the mention of the horse. Emma said to take the gray mare. The mare was Bram's. Bram came down in his dressing gown with his hair on end and demanded what was going on in his kitchen at such an hour. He saw the woman, the children, the wet on his flags, and his face closed. "They cannot stay," he said. "This is not an inn." "They will stay," Emma said. "You have no authority here." "They will stay." The room went quiet. The child coughed. The housekeeper stood by the door with the stable lantern. Bram looked from Emma to the woman and back, and something in Emma's face, the ash stick leaned by the settle, the candle steady in her hand, the 4 nights of copied papers behind her eyes, made him step back rather than forward. "On your head," he said, and went upstairs. Emma tended the child through the rest of the night. She sat on a stool by the fire with the little one in her lap and the shawl over both of them, and she listened to the breath ease and thicken and ease again. The doctor came at gray light, gave a powder, said the child would live if kept warm and dry, and drank a cup of tea standing. By full morning the storm had broken, and the yard was a wreck of branches and slate. The tenant's wife wept quietly against Emma's shoulder and could not speak. Emma told her to stay as long as she needed, and told the housekeeper to open the 2 rooms above the scullery. Then Emma put on her cloak, took the ash stick, took the second set of copies from beneath her mattress, and set out for the market town on foot, because the roads were foul and no cart would go. She walked all day. The wind was at her back for the first hour and against her for the rest. She did not stop. She had chosen in the kitchen at midnight, and the choice was still being made with every step. She reached the market town at dusk, footsore, splashed to the knee, and asked the way to the solicitor her mother had named. The office was above a saddler's on the square, up a narrow stair worn hollow in the middle. The solicitor was a spare man in a gray coat with ink on the side of his hand. He asked Emma to sit. Emma laid the copies on his desk in the order she had made them. The settlement, the lease, the fine, the unsent letter, and beneath them the deed to the wet plot. She did not speak while he read. He read slowly, turned each sheet with 2 fingers, and when he came to the unsent letter, he set it down and looked at Emma for a long moment. "Your mother wrote to my father," he said. "He died before she did." Emma said nothing. The solicitor took a fresh sheet and began to make a list. The parcels were 3. The low field by the ditch, the pasture strip beyond the hawthorn, the garden plot behind the cottages on the lane. To these he added, after a pause, a 4th, a house row on the lane itself, held under the same settlement, whose rents Bram had drawn for 6 years without question because no one had asked. The tenants had paid. The paper had never been changed. "The settlement stands," he said. "It was never broken. It has only been ignored." Emma slept that night at the inn on a pallet by the fire. In the morning the solicitor came with her to the parish office and to the manor court clerk, and papers were entered, and Emma signed her name in a hand that did not shake. Word traveled the way word does in a country of hedges and lanes. By the time Emma came home 2 days later on the back of a carter's wagon, the village knew. The women at the pump did not stop speaking when she passed. They nodded. The 3 men outside the smithy took off their caps. The boy who had driven geese ran ahead of the wagon to open the estate gate. In the market office, the clerk was at his counter with the ledger open and a chair set ready for her. The carter who had called her Bram's little heiress touched his hat and looked at the boards. None of it was said aloud. It did not need to be. The old woman with the brass ferule was waiting in the churchyard on the low wall as Emma passed. Emma stopped. The old woman said, "You heard the ditch, then?" Emma said, "I heard it." The old woman nodded once and went on toward her cottage without turning. Bram was at the front room window when Emma came into the yard. He came out onto the step in his frock coat and stood with his hands empty. He had no ledger and no crop. He said, "Cousin." Emma said, "Cousin." He said, "I did not know of the settlement." Emma believed him and did not say so. He said, "I will render the rents." Emma said, "The tenants stay." He said, "As you wish." He did not go back inside at once. He looked past her, at the lane and the churchyard beyond, as though he were seeing the shape of the parish for the first time, and then he went in and shut the door softly. The tenant's wife stayed in the 2 rooms above the scullery until her cottage was mended. The child got well. The doctor came once more, took no fee, and asked Emma what she meant to do with the low field. Emma meant to drain it. She meant to lay the hedge where it had slumped, and to open the well, and to keep the stone at the northeast corner clear of moss. She meant to give the garden plot to the tenant's wife on a lease in her own name, and to hold the pasture strip, and the house row, and Anne's piece, and to sign them in her own hand, as her mother had tried to do, and had not lived to finish. In her own name, she now held 4 parcels, where Bram held the house and the yard. It was more ground than he had, and it had been hers, in law, from the day of her birth. She did not say this to him. She said it only to the ash stick, in the little room at night, and to the housekeeper, who nodded once over the fire and said nothing. Winter softened. The frost went out of the ruts. On an evening in early spring, Emma walked out to the low field alone with the ash stick and stood at the stile at the top of the long slope. The sun was going down behind the hedge, and the light on the standing water in the hollows was the color of new brass. A crow lifted from the far corner and settled again. The rushes moved once and were still. Emma went down the headland and along the boundary as she had that first cold morning, and at the northeast corner she knelt and lifted the moss from the stone and traced the A and the M with the tip of her glove. She stayed there a long time, until the light went from brass to blue and the first star showed above the hawthorn. Then she stood and set her hand on the top of the stone and said quietly, to no one, "I was not given this. I only came back for it." She walked home in the last of the light, with the ash stick sounding on the frozen crown of the lane and the deed and the papers safe in the little room behind her. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. A story about a quiet girl, a wet field, and the long patience of women who kept the papers. If it moved you, leave a kind word below, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for the next story, coming soon. A widow, a locked mill, and the ledger no one thought to open.